The large timepiece on the wall behind Speaker of the House Sam Rayburn displayed 12:28 in the afternoon. The joint emergency session of Congress he was about to commence would be the most significant in his 55 years of government service. Before him, the House chamber was packed with not only the nation's legislators but the justices of the Supreme Court, cabinet members, and top military leaders. In the crowded gallery above and behind the Speaker were accredited members of the Capitol Hill Press Corps. In the front row of the visitors' gallery sat Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of the President. Near her, by special invitation, sat the widow of President Wilson. The conversations that filled the air were brief and terse. On the House floor there was a sudden stir of excitement. Rayburn struck his gavel for silence. The doorkeeper of the House arrived at the center aisle and announced, "Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States." From a side door, President Roosevelt slowly entered the packed chamber, leaning heavily on the arm of his son, James, who was dressed in the dark green of a Marine captain. There was a hush and then a roar of applause as the entire assemblage rose simultaneously and watched the President make his way slowly to the platform just below Rayburn. The genial Rayburn allowed the applause to continue briefly, then held up his hands for quiet. A chaplain gave a brief prayer, and then Rayburn motioned for the audience to be seated. The President spread open a black loose-leaf notebook, grasped both sides of the podium firmly, and paused to look at his audience. Then, in those measured, resonant tones that the whole world had come to know, he began to speak. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America, was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Describing the events of the previous 24 hours, the President recited the list of Japanese conquests and announced, "As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense. But always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory." Cheers, whistles and applause interrupted the President at this point. He looked up at the audience, smiled, and raised his hand in acknowledgement. Continuing, the President put into words what the whole nation and the non-Axis world hoped he would. He had given the promise of revenge and hope for victory that everyone needed. He concluded by saying, "I ask that Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire. In the few minutes that the President had spoken, a national resolve was formed. Millions of Americans began the slow recovery from the state of shock which had gripped them during the previous 24 hours when the ugly news from the Pacific first poured in. If the Japanese had calculated that the American people would be cowed into submission by the disaster in the Pacific, they had not studied American history. The same nation that had coined such phrases as "United we stand, divided we fall," and "Remember the Maine," proclaimed a new one, "Remember Pearl Harbor." The policeman at the White House gate stepped out of his guardhouse as the Army staff car approached. He held up his hand to the driver, indicating he wanted to check the occupants in the rear seat. The officer peered inside and instantly recognized the stern, unsmiling face of General George C. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff. Seated on Marshall's left with the ever-present grin that had earned him the nickname of Hap, sat General Henry H. Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Forces. The guard smiled back at Arnold and waved the car inside the White House grounds. It had been exactly 2 weeks, almost to the hour, that the first news of the Pearl Harbor attack had reached the White House. Upon Marshall and Arnold had fallen the unprecedented burden of planning and directing the mobilization of the most powerful army and air force the world had ever known. Daily since that infamous Pearl Harbor Sunday, Marshall had reported Army problems and plans to the President, along with his Navy counterpart, Admiral Ernest J. King. Today, Arnold had been invited, and the group assembling outside the President's study included Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's special advisor, Admiral Harold R. Stark, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, and Admiral King. They were shown into the study, and the President greeted his visitors cordially one by one. Although the weight of responsibility on him was greater than on any president in history, he did not show it. When the visitors had taken their seats, Roosevelt announced that Sir Winston Churchill and his top military leaders would arrive the next day and asked that the group be ready to discuss the strategic problems confronting the two countries at subsequent meetings. General Marshall gave the President his estimate of the entire global war situation, after which the President discussed the war situation in Africa and England and then turned his attention to the Far East. He was interested in striking back at Japan at the earliest possible moment and asked everyone present to consider ways and means to attack Japan as soon as possible. He then asked what had been done so far. Marshall briefed the President on plans to militarize the ex-Army and Navy officers who were flying for General Claire L. Chennault with the American Volunteer Group in China. Roosevelt emphasized that he wanted a bombing raid on Japan proper as soon as humanly possible to bolster the morale of America and her allies. This emphatic request, which was repeated over and over again, made a profound impression on everyone present. The President's sense of urgency was immediately transferred by Marshall, Arnold, and King to their respective staffs when they returned to their offices. Arnold was greatly encouraged by this meeting. He had been apprehensive about the President's understanding of air power's potential, but Roosevelt's grasp of the total war situation was impressive, and Arnold's fears were now gone. From that time forward, he later wrote, there was no doubt about the commanding general of the Army Air Forces being a member of the President's staff. When Arnold returned to his office from this White House meeting, he immediately dictated his notes to a secretary. The resulting memorandum, passed from Arnold to the War Plans Division of the Air Staff, became a directive to begin planning for retaliatory airstrikes against Japan. At 10:30 in the morning on the day before Christmas, Arnold met with the British Army, Navy, and Air Force leaders who had come with Churchill. Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal, Arnold's British counterpart, had some very definite ideas about what the American military forces should do to stem the spread of the Axis threat. He was particularly firm in his advice about the Japanese. Portal told Arnold that an attack on Japan was a Navy task, because carriers could sneak up on Japan and make the same kind of attack that the Japanese had made on Pearl Harbor. The risk would be no different than that taken by British carriers at Taranto or by the Japanese carriers near Hawaii. This kind of strategy, he reasoned, would cause the Japanese fleet to return to its home islands and allow the Allies to strengthen themselves in the Pacific. Arnold was not impressed with Portal's logic. I always thought that Portal mixed wishful thinking in with his reasoning concerning the Pacific air strategy, Arnold said later. I thought he was afraid if our Air Force planned to use heavy bombers against Japan, it would cut down the number he would receive. In addition, Arnold felt it would be self-destructive for the Navy to bring their carriers within range of Japanese land-based aviation. The situation was not the same as Portal had intimated. At that moment, the only way to attack Japan seemed to be to operate heavy bombers from East Chinese bases, as the President obviously wanted. The conferences with the British, to be known as the Arcadia conferences, lasted through January 14, 1942. During the time the British war leaders were in the States, meetings were held almost daily with the President, the Prime Minister, and the combined Chiefs of Staff in attendance. These were always formal gatherings and were usually followed by meetings of working committees made up of representatives from each country's Army, Navy, and Air Force. The subjects discussed and strategy agreed upon covered every phase of the war against the Axis powers. At 5:30 in the evening on January 4th, the combined chiefs met with Roosevelt and Churchill in the White House. One of the principal subjects on the agenda was the unsettled French situation in North Africa. Admiral King voiced his opinion about the United States Navy's part in the intended landing operations, saying that 3 carriers should be sent to the area. He thought that one carrier should have about 75 or 80 Navy fighters aboard, and another should carry about 80 or 100 Army fighters. The third should be used to transport Army bombers and carry gas, bombs, and ammunition. Arnold did not take issue with King's suggestion, but he knew there would be some problems to solve. That night, back in his office in the munitions building, Arnold transcribed his notes and wrote, "By transporting these Army bombers on a carrier, it will be necessary for us to take off from the carrier, which brings up the question of what kind of plane B-18 bomber and DC-3 for cargo. We will have to try bomber takeoffs from carriers. It has never been done before, but we must try out and check on how long it takes." The War Plans Division of the Army Air Forces staff studied this unusual memorandum from Arnold and began the necessary checking of technical data. to work his idea into the North African invasion plan. Army fighters could probably be launched either from the deck of a carrier or by catapult, but a loaded B-18 bomber or a DC-3 cargo plane. It would take some experimentation to find out. The fact that it has never been done before did not bother the flyers assigned to planning tasks. The Army Air Forces owed its very existence to the fact that it had done things that had no precedent, that it dared to proceed unhampered by tradition. Arnold had said that it must be tried out, and that is what would be done. Therefore, the requirement to consider the feasibility of launching land-based heavy planes from carriers was turned over to the air staff officers assigned to plan for the invasion of North Africa. Simultaneously, other flying officers were writing and rewriting plans to bomb Japan from China. They were also to consider any other possibilities of conducting attacks against the Japanese homeland and forward those plans to Arnold for his consideration in line with the President's desires. The seed of the idea of using a Navy carrier to transport Army planes to an area of operations had been planted by Admiral King, but King did not envision medium bombers and large transports actually flying from a carrier's deck. This innovation was conceived in the brilliant mind of General Arnold on that bitter cold 4th day of January, 1942. However, Arnold did not realize just how good his idea was. Its value was not to be evident until 3.5 months later. Different airplanes were to be launched from carriers against the enemy, and it was against a different enemy in another theater of war. The first month of war found the defensive structure of the Allied nations crumbling along every front. In the Pacific, one Japanese victory followed another with alarming rapidity. United States forces in the Philippines had retreated into the Bataan Peninsula. The British Army, having surrendered the base at Penang, was retreating southward, and the Japanese were able to continue their advance upon Singapore at almost a marching pace with only token resistance. In the Dutch East Indies, enemy forces had landed on Borneo, Timor, Celebes, and New Guinea. The rapid pace of Japanese successes was not offset by any showing of Allied power. The sinking of the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse in the Gulf of Siam on December 10th added to the gloom of the Allies. The fall of Wake Island on December 23rd only confirmed the worst fears of the public that the United States Navy had been rendered impotent by the raid on Pearl Harbor. Wake Island was closer to Hawaii than Japan, which further proved Japanese boldness. The fact that the United States Navy could do nothing about it convinced the general public that the situation was desperate. In the Philippines at the close of the year, there was no doubt that organized resistance to the Japanese onslaught was practically at an end. On December 30th, President Manuel Quezon and Vice President Sergio Osmeña had been sworn in for their second terms as guns roared in the distance. Quezon, confined to a wheelchair, had read a message to the small crowd assembled at the entrance to Malinta Tunnel. It was from President Roosevelt and was a sincere attempt to bolster the morale of the Filipinos and their gallant American defenders. The message read, "News of your gallant struggle against the Japanese aggressors has elicited the profound admiration of every American. I give to the people of the Philippines my solemn pledge that their freedom will be redeemed and their independence established and protected. The entire resources in men and materials of the United States stand behind that pledge." Roosevelt's message gave the 15,000 Americans and 65,000 Filipinos who had escaped to Bataan renewed courage and hope. Behind the rugged terrain of Bataan, they were supposed to hold out for 6 months, if need be, and await the coming of massive fleets of ships and planes from the States. These massive fleets did not exist, but the men still alive on Bataan did not know it. They could only wait and fight and try to stay alive. On December 18th, Amon G. Carter, publisher of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram and well-known aviation enthusiast, wrote to his old friend, Major General Edwin M. Parr Watson, military secretary to the President Carter, like hundreds of other well-meaning Americans, thought he had an original idea which would help win the war. He naively suggested that 500 long-range bombers should pelt Tokyo using airline pilots, each plane carrying 2,000 to 4,000 pounds of explosives. Watson forwarded Carter's letter to General Arnold on December 30th for his comment. On January 7th, knowing that his planners were considering all possible ways to use heavy armament against Japan, Arnold replied that, "The fundamental idea is sound, but the problem of execution is something more than that expressed by Mr. Carter. However, We will have a solution in the near future which we hope will get the results desired. Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, was tired from the Arcadia conference meetings he had been attending all day. He left his office in the Navy building about 8 in the evening and ordered his driver to take him to the Washington Navy Yard, where a former German yacht, the Vixen, was moored. The Vixen was serving as his flagship and second office where he could work undisturbed far into the night. Several key members of King's staff also lived and worked aboard with their chief. For them, the war was an around-the-clock business, especially since the bad news of Japanese conquests had been coming in daily, apparently without an end in sight. Earlier that day, Saturday, January 10th, the president had reiterated his desire to strike Japan and asked King, Marshall, and Arnold to keep their respective staffs thinking of ways and means to carry the fight to the enemy and bolster public morale. So far, none of them had yet come up with a definite plan. After dinner, King retired to his cabin. Captain Francis S. Lowe, a submariner and operations officer on King's staff, waited a few minutes and then decided to speak to his superior alone. King was not an easy man to talk to, and few outside the small circle of his staff felt comfortable in his presence. He had an aloof, serious demeanor, not unlike that of his army counterpart, Marshall. Neither man smiled much. Indeed, in those days there was not much to smile about. The nation's fate in large measure rested in their hands. Lowe knocked and King invited him inside. "Yes, Lowe, what is on your mind?" Lowe got right to the point. "Sir, I have got an idea for bombing Japan I would like to talk to you about." King was immediately interested. Like Arnold, he had sent memos to his staff after every meeting with the President, and Roosevelt's frequent mention of air raids against Japan had been transmitted to them. Lowe continued, "I flew down to Norfolk today to check on the readiness of our new carrier, the Hornet, and saw something that started me thinking." Lowe paused, then talked faster. "The enemy knows that the radius of action of carrier aircraft is limited to about 300 miles. Today, as we were taking off from Norfolk, I saw the outline of a carrier deck painted on the airfield which is used to give our pilots practice in taking off from a short distance." King was patient with Lowe, but so far Lowe had not told him anything new. "I do not understand what you are getting at, Lowe." "Well, sir, I saw some Army twin-engine planes making bombing passes at this simulated carrier deck at the same time. If the Army has some longer-range planes than our Navy fighters, maybe a medium bomber like the B-25 or B-26, and if they could take off in the length of a carrier deck, then it seems to me a few of them could be loaded on a carrier and used to pelt Japan. It would be a mighty big surprise to the Japanese, and would certainly build up the morale of the American people." King leaned back and said nothing for a minute. Lowe felt uneasy and expected a curt rebuff. It would not have been his first when he advanced a new idea to King. "Lowe, you may have something there. Talk to Duncan about it in the morning." "Yes, sir," Lowe said, pleased, and turned to go. This backhanded, favorable reaction of the old man was like getting a commendation medal. "One thing, Lowe," King cautioned. "Do not tell anyone else about this." Lowe immediately phoned Captain Donald B. Wu Duncan at his Washington apartment. Duncan, a 1917 graduate of the Naval Academy, was King's air operations officer and was highly respected for his planning ability and knowledge of carrier aviation. "Wu, I have got something important I would like to talk to you about," Lowe told him. "Can you meet me at the office tomorrow morning?" "Sure," Duncan replied. Although King had promised that his overworked staff would have Sunday off, Duncan knew that Lowe, his senior and personal friend, would not be calling without good reason. When they met next morning, Lowe explained his idea and how he had conceived it the day before. Fortuitous association, he later called it. "As I see it," Lowe told Duncan, "there are two big questions to be answered. First, can such a planear land-based twin-engine medium bomber land aboard a carrier? And secondly, can such a plane, stripped down to its absolute essentials and loaded with gasoline and bombs, take off from a carrier deck? If either one or both questions can be answered affirmatively, we may have a whole new concept of operation to go on." "The answer to your first question is a definite negative," Duncan told him. "In the first place, a carrier deck is too short to land an Army medium bomber safely. Even if one could stop in time, there would be no place to stow it because it would not fit on an elevator to be taken below and make way for the next plane. Both the B-25 and B-26 have tricycle landing gear. This design increases landing speeds, and the tails are so high off the deck that there is no way to install a landing hook. Besides, if we could figure out a hook design, the tail structures are too weak to take the shock of hard, sudden stop landings. And your second question? That will take some figuring. I will get to work and let you know. All right, Lowe told him. But the Admiral said to be sure that not another soul finds out what you are working on. Lowe recounted years later that Duncan normally would have had available to him all sorts of talent to perform computations that had to be made in order to determine the feasibility of the study. Instead of that, Duncan had to lock himself up for a few days and do everything himself. Woo! Duncan found a vacant office and buried himself in the details of his study. He made discreet inquiries of the Army concerning the B-25 and B-26 aircraft, asking for such information as landing speeds, dimensions, range, and load capabilities. He checked Navy files for the figures on deck space of the various carriers. Historical records were consulted to see what experience the Navy had had previously with taking off heavily loaded planes in short distances. Weather patterns were studied to determine the best time for raids against the islands of Japan. And most important, Duncan carefully checked distances to be flown against the capabilities of each airplane. At the end of 5 days, Duncan came up with a 30-page analysis, handwritten since he had not wanted to entrust his study to a typist. He made only one copy, and so far as is known, it is the only complete document concerning the planning for the raid the Navy ever made. Its whereabouts today are unknown. Duncan, a perfectionist and brilliant staff officer, who later rose to 4-star Admiral and Vice Chief of Naval Operations, had done a thorough job of thinking through the problems that would have to be faced and solved. The one vital element in any plan to strike Japan from carriers would be surprise. Surprise meant absolute secrecy. For any naval task force in the Pacific would be a prime target and encourage the Japanese to attack with every weapon at their command to finish the job on the United States fleet they had started at Pearl Harbor. All operations, therefore, should be top secret, and few, if any, records should be kept of arrangements. The lives of over 10,000 men would be at stake if the plan leaked out. For the planes, Duncan settled on the North American B-25 as the only plane that could possibly be used. 4-engine planes were out of the question. The Martin B-26s required too much takeoff distance. The Douglas B-23 had too much wingspan to get by the island on a carrier and its predecessor. The Douglas B-18 did not have the range, nor could it carry a worthwhile bomb load if it were modified to carry extra gas. The B-25, properly modified, could carry 2,000 pounds of bombs and make a 2,000-mile flight provided extra gas tanks were installed. Normally, it would need at least 1,200 feet of runway with that kind of a load. If it were lightened, however, it might be made to leap off in a little over a third of that distance, especially with the aid of the forward speed of a carrier and a wind of about 25 knots. Duncan felt that the carrier Hornet would be the ideal vehicle to transport and launch the B-25s. Commissioned in October 1941 and completing her shakedown cruise at the time of his report, she was due to sail from Norfolk in February for the Pacific. Her decks would take 16 B-25s, and she could steam ahead at 25 knots or better. Using a screening force of one other carrier, cruisers, destroyers, and tankers, the Hornet could be brought to within about 500 miles of the Japanese coast and the 25s launched. After dropping explosives at the selected targets in Japan, they could proceed to China, and the task force could retreat to safer waters. Army pilots, Duncan knew, were not trained to take off in extremely short distances. The pilots selected would have to practice on land with varying loads until they could all take off in the distance the length of a carrier's deck. Modifications would have to be made to the B-25 to give it added gas capacity. Every extra mile that the B-25s could add to their range meant one less mile that the task force would have to risk inside the range of Japanese land-based aviation. But this meant added weight, and weight meant either more takeoff distance required or less of a bomb load. It would not make sense to have the planes so loaded with gas they could not carry enough bombs to do any damage. There would have to be a compromise, and in Duncan's study these computations were fairly well worked out. However, to be perfectly sure, he knew an experimental run should be made, Otherwise, it meant risking the lives of many men. At the end of the 5th day, Duncan told Lowe he thought he had the answers and suggested they both see Admiral King. Once inside King's office, Duncan briefed his superior on his conclusions. King, unsmiling as usual, leafed through the handwritten sheets while his two subordinates stood by uneasily. When he had finished reading, King was thoughtful for a moment and then said, briskly, "Go, see General Arnold about it, and if he agrees with you, ask him to get in touch with me. But do not mention this to another soul." The two officers turned to leave and King called them back. "Duncan, if this plan gets the green light from Arnold, I want you to handle the Navy end of it," he said, and then dismissed the pair with a wave of his hand. Duncan nodded. He had not realized that he would have a part in implementing the plan, but he was delighted. He and Lowe immediately made an appointment to see General Arnold the next day, January 17th. With each passing hour in the closing days of 1941, the news from the Pacific got worse. General Arnold pushed his staff day and night to plan the rapid expansion of the Army Air Forces to cope with the widening spread of enemy power. His greatest need, he soon found, was for strong, capable air leaders who could build the Air Force being formed on paper into lean, hard-fighting units capable of gaining back the initiative from the enemy. But good men with flying experience, leadership ability and guts were hard to find. Our reservoir of skilled and experienced officers was so shallow, Arnold later wrote, that every time we lost one, he was almost irreplaceable. One of Arnold's irreplaceable air officers was Major James H. Jimmy Doolittle, master of the calculated risk, who had won nearly every aviation trophy there was, and some of them twice. Racing and test pilot, aeronautical scientist, and holder of many aviation firsts, Doolittle was a man whose fast-paced activities certainly belied his name. Not only was he the first man to fly across the United States in less than 24 hours, but also the first to do it in less than 12. He was the first to fly an outside loop and first to take off, fly a set course, and land without seeing the ground, thus pioneering the science of blind flying. He had won the Schneider, Bendix, Thompson, Mackay, Harmon, Guggenheim, and Wright brothers trophies besides a number of foreign awards, and had earned his doctoral degree in aeronautical engineering from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He was, and is, without a doubt, the most famous flyer in the world. Doolittle had missed seeing service in World War I, and he has never gotten over this oversight. He enlisted for flight training in November 1917 and became a flying instructor after graduation. In 1921, he participated in the Mitchell-directed battleship bombings off the Virginia Capes. Between then and the late 1930s, his name became synonymous with daredevil piloting. Contrary to popular belief, Jimmy stayed in the Air Corps during his record-shattering days until 1930, when he resigned his regular commission as a first lieutenant to go into commercial aviation. He was given a reserve commission as a major, however, and maintained an active association with the struggling peacetime Air Corps. When war broke out in Europe in September 1939, Doolittle was sure that war was eventually coming to America. After a trip to Europe where he saw the growing Luftwaffe firsthand, he got in touch with Hap Arnold, his friend of many years, and asked to be called back to active duty. On July 1, 1940, orders were issued assigning him as a major to Indianapolis, Indiana, with duty as Assistant District Supervisor of the Central Air Corps Procurement District. 4 months later, Doolittle was transferred to Detroit. These two assignments were not an attempt to shelve the world-famous flyer and keep him out of the cockpit. President Roosevelt's plans to make America the arsenal of democracy meant mass conversion of American industry, from peacetime goods to war material. Retooling and reorganizing was a mammoth, almost impossible task. Arnold knew that Doolittle was one of the few men in the country who had not only the necessary engineering background but the tact and finesse needed to deal with industry as well. In Detroit, Doolittle's ingenuity and talent for getting things done paid off. The conversion of the auto industry to production of airplane parts was one of the most difficult in American history. By December 7th, the entire automotive industry had agreed on their terminal quotas last private cars for the duration. Representing the Army Air Forces, Jimmy helped make the conversion to war production as smooth as possible. Throughout the time that Doolittle had been in Indianapolis and Detroit, he had kept in close touch with Arnold. Although not on Arnold's staff and far beneath him in the chain of command, No one ever tried to stop Doolittle from going out of channels to contact Arnold directly when he had a problem. He did not abuse the privilege which their friendship had given him, however, and always used it in the best interests of getting his assigned job done. The day before Christmas, 1941, Arnold telephoned Doolittle in Detroit. "Jim," Arnold said, "I would like to see you here in Washington. How soon can you come?" Doolittle, the man who can never stand still, gave the answer Arnold expected. "I will be there in about 4 hours." When Doolittle strode briskly into Arnold's office in Washington, the conversation was brief. "I want you to move down here and be on my staff," he told Jimmy. "I have got to be sure that we get the equipment we really need in the months to come, and that the stuff coming off the production lines is operationally ready when we get it. I would like you to clean up your projects in Detroit and move on down here as soon as possible." Doolittle understood the problem perfectly. Between wars, the Army's stepchild air arm, because of budgetary limitations, had to be more interested in aircraft performance than in the purely military requirements in support of a doctrine for air warfare. The airplane was now going to war, and it had to do other things besides fly high and fast. It had to be capable of carrying the fight to the enemy's homeland and destroying his war-making potential. Doolittle was to be Arnold's troubleshooter, and this role appealed to the indomitable airman who had an unmatched reputation of accomplishment. Doolittle's only concern, however, was that he might have to fly a desk for the duration. He had missed one war, and he did not want to miss another. It was several days before Doolittle cleared up the loose ends in Detroit and moved to Washington. Official records show he was promoted to lieutenant colonel on January 2, 1942, and transferred to Headquarters, Army Air Forces on January 9th. However, correspondence in official files proves that he was at his desk in Washington and working on vital problems concerning the B-26 Marauder at least a week previously. It was an unforgiving airplane, Doolittle recalled, and it was taking the lives of pilots because it never gave them a chance to make mistakes. Hap Arnold wanted me to check into the airplane and recommend to him whether it should continue to be built or not. I checked it over, flew it, and liked it. There was not anything about it that good piloting skill could not overcome. I recommended it continue to be built, and it was. General Arnold confirmed this in his memoirs. "Our new pilots were afraid of the B-26, he wrote. "And we had one accident after another. Seemingly, all that was necessary was for one engine to go sour on a B-26 while in flight, and it would crash. At the time the B-26 trouble was at its height, I called Doolittle to my office, told him I would like to have him go out, take a B-26, fly it under any and all conditions, and then go down to the B-26 outfit, take command, and show those boys that flying this ship was no different from flying any other. Doolittle did this, and before he left the outfit he had the boys flying the B-26 on one engine, making landings and taking off with one engine, just as easily as they had formerly done with two. The B-26 problem was the first project Arnold had assigned him. Although he did not know it yet, he was soon to be involved with another airplane and again to show that with the right equipment and the right training, impossible things could be done. When Captains Lowe and Duncan presented their idea to Hap Arnold on January 17th, Arnold, as Lowe said later, was most enthusiastic about a carrier-based raid against Japan. He did not tell them that he had already asked his staff to check into the feasibility of just such a plan in connection with the forthcoming invasion of North Africa, and that his staff was still pondering his memo of January 4th. Staff members had not yet made their recommendations to him because of the workload imposed by the Arcadia conference, which was just ending. No one was really sure if a land-based bomber could actually take off from the rolling pitching deck of a carrier. There would be only one way to find out. Arnold liked the idea and immediately got in touch with King. After they had settled the fundamental division of responsibility between them, it was decided that Captain Wu Duncan would be the overall Navy coordinator to handle all Navy logistic planning for the operation. Whomever Arnold chose to handle the Army Air Force's side of the task would have the job of overseeing the modification of the planes and training the crews. The man Arnold needed for this kind of mission had to be a man who was used to doing the impossible with an airplane. He had to be not only an experienced pilot, but someone who could inspire others by example, and who knew airplanes not only as a pilot knows them, but as an aeronautical engineer. There was only one man in the whole Air Force who could meet those specifications. Arnold sent down the hall for Jimmy Doolittle. The selection of Doolittle to lead this nearly self-destructive mission was a natural one, Arnold later explained. He was fearless, technically brilliant, a leader who not only could be counted upon to do a task himself if it were humanly possible, but could impart that spirit to others. Doolittle saluted and returned Arnold's ever-present smile as he entered his chief's office. After a little friendly chit-chat, Arnold was suddenly serious. "Jim, what airplane have we got that will get off in 500 feet with a 2,000-pound bomb load and fly 2,000 miles? Doolittle pondered a moment before answering. The Air Force had planes that could take off in 500 feet, but none that could do that and fly such a bomb load for such a distance. Still, if properly modified, maybe the B-18, B-23, or the B-25 could do it. The B-26 needed too much takeoff distance, and the heavy four-engine bombers could never be souped up to get off in that shorter distance. General, I will need a little time on that one. Give me a day or two and I will have an answer for you." "Okay, Jim, but keep this under your hat and let me know as soon as you can." Next day, Doolittle reported back to Arnold. "It narrows down to either the B-23 or the B-25, but either one will take some modifying. One more fact you should know that I did not tell you is that the plane must take off from a narrow area not over 75 feet wide. Well, then the only answer is the B-25. It has a 67-foot wingspan. The B-23 would never make it off safely. Now, what is behind all this?" Arnold quickly passed on the basic idea to Doolittle, who caught his boss's enthusiasm immediately. "Jim," he said, "I need someone to take this project over. Get the planes modified and train the crews." "And I know where you can get that someone," Doolittle interjected. Arnold grinned. He knew that was the way it would be. "Okay, it is your baby. Let me know what you need and I will see that you get it." This was the kind of problem-solving Doolittle liked. Arnold then talked briefly with Admiral King. "We will get your men within striking distance of Japan," King said. "Then it is up to them. We will shoot for a West Coast departure of about the 1st of April. If that is okay with you, I will send Duncan to Pearl Harbor when the time is right and relay the plan to Admiral Nimitz. I will let you know when we are ready for you. As I see it, the biggest problem will be security. The fewer who know what we are doing, the better," Arnold agreed. Not only would the lives of hundreds of men in the Naval Task Force depend on how well the secret was kept, but the crews of the bombers too. If the element of surprise were lost, the Japanese could have their numerically superior naval forces out waiting to catch what they missed at Pearl Harbor. Clouds of fighters would be ready to pounce on the Mitchells as they neared the home islands. No one had to remind Arnold of the consequences if word of the mission got out. The two veteran airmen, Duncan and Doolittle, had their orders and went their separate ways. Both knew by instinct and experience exactly what they had to do. In spite of its informal beginnings, the plan for a carrier-based raid on Tokyo was not to be a hastily conceived devil-may-care operation. Some writers, not knowing the whole story, have described the raid as a desperate attempt to inflict indiscriminate damage on the enemy's stronghold and perhaps eliminate the emperor himself. Such was not the case. The B-25 raid on Japan was only a piece of a master plan to build up American power in the Far East, assist China in driving the invaders out, and carry the war to the Japanese homeland. At the highest levels of the War Department, concepts of operations for the future conduct of the war in the Far East were not yet firm in the first week of January 1942. General George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army, did not agree with Secretary of War Stimson's views on how the war was to be fought in the Orient. Stimson wanted a full-scale theater of operations established. Marshall and his planners, led by a staff officer named Dwight D. Eisenhower, seemed to favor a military mission with an emphasis on air power. The idea was to lend American Army advisors to the Chinese to help them whip their almost limitless manpower resources into a powerful ground force. The paper prepared by Eisenhower's experts in the War Plans Division expressed the War Department's official view as 1. To provide equipment to the Chinese Army to enable it to continue operations against the Japanese. This includes assistance in the maintenance of communications. 2. Instigating Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek to intensify Chinese effort and to restore the waning spirit of the Chinese in carrying on the conflict. 3. To secure, maintain, and operate air bases for air operations against the Japanese. 4. To organize various types of American units by enlistment in the American Army to carry on guerrilla warfare. Proposals had already been made to Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek in Chungking, asking him to accept the nomination as Supreme Commander of an Allied China theater. The Generalissimo accepted about January 5th and asked that Roosevelt send a high-ranking American Army general to be chief of the Allied staff. General Joseph W. Vinegar Joe Stilwell, blunt, outspoken, indefatigable infantryman, was nominated, accepted, and duly assigned. His job, as he saw it, was to coordinate and smooth out and run the Burma Road, and get various factions together and grab command. As the days passed relentlessly by and American policy in regard to the China situation was being painfully formulated, the Japanese continued their daily advance south and westward. The Burma Road, vital ground transportation link to China, had to be kept open. It would take prodigious Allied effort ground and air to stop the enemy's advance and keep the supply lines from being shut off. At the end of January, T.V. Soong, Chinese ambassador to the United States, gloomily forecast the closing of the Burma Road and asked for 100 DC-3 transports to fly war material over the hump and keep China fighting. The underrated Japanese forces had shattered all Allied estimates of their ability to fight and did so with such bewildering speed that war maps in Washington were continually out of date. The importance of United States air aid to China grew as more and more territory was lost to the enemy. By the beginning days of February, there was no doubt that Soong was right and that eventually a major air effort would be needed which would have to be predominantly American. If air transport routes were to be established, they would have to be well organized and coordinated, and they would have to be protected. Any offensive efforts by Allied ground armies could only be made under an umbrella of friendly air cover. The end of resistance in Burma was now definitely in sight. If the pressure were not relieved and more attention given to the ever-worsening situation in the Far East, it appeared there would be no end to Japanese aggression. Even before the Chinese ambassador's dire prediction, plans were well advanced by mid-January in the Air War Plans Division to establish a major fighting air command, the 10th Air Force, in Burma. An advanced detachment, under the codename Aquila, was organized to be the nucleus of the build-up of American air power in China. There were to be 5 separate but related projects in this initial build-up. 1. The flight of B-25s to be dispatched from a carrier were to provide the first medium bombing aircraft for use in China. Pilots and crews were to be absorbed into the 10th Air Force after their mission. 2. 35 DC-3 transports were to be provided to form the aerial lifeline of supply. 3. A group of 33 A-29 attack planes under the command of Colonel Leo H. Dawson were to be ferried from the factory to the Chinese Air Force under the Lend-Lease Agreement. The pilots were then to be assigned to the 10th Air Force. 4. 23 B-24 heavy bombers, under command of Colonel Harrier Halverson, were to be the first long-range bombers assigned to the 10th. It was this unit, known as the Halpro Group, that was to open up long-range strategic attacks on Japan from Chinese bases. 5. 51 P-40Es were to be assembled at Takoradi, West Africa, and ferried to China for the use of Chennault's group, whether or not it was absorbed into the American Air Forces. These 5 separate projects, once approved, were assigned to the various leaders chosen to carry them out. The last 4 projects, to be carried out independently of the others, were given secret status. The first, now assigned to Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, was top secret because of the mission his planes were to perform en route from the carrier to the destination in China. In the beginning, only 5 men, King, Arnold, Doolittle, Duncan, and Lowe, knew that this project had been approved. Records do not reveal, but it is believed that Arnold let one other person in on the plan, President Roosevelt. However, there is some doubt that the president was told any details until later. At 2 in the afternoon on January 28, 1942, Arnold again met with the President, Secretary of War, Admiral King, General Marshall, and others in the White House. Discussions of strategy centered around the situation in the Pacific and the Far East. In his report of that meeting, Arnold noted that the President asked about the progress being made on plans for attacking Japan. At that time, the Doolittle project was underway, Arnold recalled. But all those present did not yet know about it, and we did not want it to be common knowledge, so I steered clear of it and talked about bombing Japan from China and Russia. The official memorandum of that meeting reports, General Arnold stated that at present a man is working on this proposition of bombing from China or Russia, that it will take a few months to get the gasoline and fields available, after which bombing from China could start. Also that a route across the Aleutians is being developed for a way down the coast of Siberia. The President stated that, from a psychological standpoint, both of Japan and the United States, it was most important to use heavy armaments against Japan as soon as possible, that he had been studying on a map the location of the latest Sino, Japanese lines, and in the northern part of China he was surprised to see that the line was considerably closer to Japan than he had previously thought. General Arnold stated that plans for bombing from China contemplated that the bombers would fly to advanced bases in the evening, land, regas, fly over Japan, land at the advanced bases, and then return to a base in the rear. The President directed that the possibilities of establishing bases in northern China be looked into. He also asked if there were any possibilities of bombing from the Aleutian Islands, but it was pointed out that the distances involved were too great. While Arnold thus concerned himself with broad air strategy on a global basis, the orders detailing those selected to carry out the thousands of tasks in support of that strategy began to flow out of headquarters, Army Air Forces. Doolittle needed no orders. Sitting as he did at the elbow of Arnold, his position and his fame were all the authority he needed. Special Aviation Project No. 1 was underway. In Washington, Captain Duncan had quickly set the wheels in motion for the Navy's part in the coming raid with his request that a submarine be dispatched to send back weather data. Lieutenant Commander William L. Anderson, skipper of the United States ship Thresher, was instructed to take his ship into Japanese waters via Midway Island, observe enemy shipping and attack targets of opportunity. In addition, he was to surface at regular intervals and make weather observations. Temperature, pressure, wind direction, wind speed, sealing, and visibility were to be meticulously noted. Knowledge of the weather over and around the Japanese islands was important to such a mission, and could easily mean the difference between its success or failure. Not only the aircraft, but the entire task force used to get the planes to their launching points could be endangered by running into unexpected typhoons or severe storms. The mission of the Thresher was only the first of the many arrangements Duncan had to make. A force of ships had to be planned to escort and protect the carrier carrying the Army B-25s. Destroyers, cruisers, oilers, submarines, and at least one other carrier would be required. This meant obtaining provisions, fuel, ammunition, and manpower. Gathering such a force would put a severe strain on the Pacific Fleet, still trying to recover from Pearl Harbor. The risk of loss to the Navy was great. There could be no slip-ups. One vitally important question had to be answered before plans went too far. Both Duncan and Doolittle had carefully and independently calculated that it was mathematically possible for a combat-loaded B-25 to lift off a carrier deck. But could their figures be wrong? Could there be some mysterious aerodynamic reason that the as-yet untried Mitchell bomber might not be able to get itself airborne in a deck length of a little over 450 feet? Duncan was determined to find out personally. The United States ship Hornet, the Navy's newest carrier, was due in Norfolk on January 31st to be readied for her first war mission. There would be no better chance, Duncan figured, to see how right or wrong he was. Besides, the Hornet might be the very carrier that would be used for the raid. He made arrangements with Arnold's office to have 3 B-25s waiting at the dockside when the Hornet arrived at the huge Hampton Roads installation. He then radioed Captain Mark Amitcher, skipper of the Hornet, that he would come aboard at Norfolk to discuss urgent business. The Army Air Force crews selected for the experiment had been well trained for the mission. Lieutenant John E. Fitzgerald, a 1940 graduate of Advanced Flying School, had about 400 hours in the B-25 when war was declared. About the middle of January, he received orders to proceed to Norfolk, where he was put in charge of 2 other crews also assigned to the mission. In Norfolk, he flew about 30 test runs at one of the auxiliary fields, as did the pilots of the other 2 planes. One of the planes lost an engine and did not participate thereafter. On the afternoon of February 1st, Duncan, brisk and businesslike, reported to Mitcher aboard the Hornet and discussed the experiment with him. Early the next day, Fitzgerald's two B-25s were towed to dockside. A huge loading derrick was attached to a specially constructed sling, and the Mitchells were swung aboard the Hornet and lashed down. On February 2, 1942, the Hornet was underway, and about the middle of the afternoon the flyers were advised to man their planes. Duncan and Mitcher stood together on the port side of the ship's bridge in their foul-weather gear and watched the preparations below them on the wind-swept deck. The first B-25 was manoeuvred into position, and the launching officer signalled to Fitzgerald to rev up his engines to the maximum. At the proper instant, the go signal was given. The Mitchell raced down the gently sloping deck and lifted easily into the air with space to spare. From the pilot's point of view, the takeoff was not without its moment of excitement. When they spotted the planes for takeoff, Fitzgerald said, "I was surprised to observe that we had been provided almost 500 feet of usable deck, and that the plane's airspeed indicator showed about 45 miles per hour just sitting there. This meant we had to accelerate only about 23 miles per hour. When I got the go signal, I let the brakes off and was almost immediately airborne, well ahead of my estimate. One thing that worried me, though, was the projection of the island out over the flight deck on which the skipper stood, so he could have a clear view of the deck operations. The wing of my plane rose so rapidly that I thought we were going to strike this projection. I pushed the control column forward, and the wing just barely passed underneath. I climbed and circled back to watch Lieutenant McCarthy take off. Lieutenant James F. McCarthy's plane was jockeyed into position and roared seaward. It, too, was airborne safely before reaching the end of the deck. The two Mitchells joined up and disappeared over the horizon. Their crews were unaware of the significance of their experiment. Duncan was now satisfied that his calculations were correct. The wind had been about 20 knots, and the speed of the Hornet had been only 10 knots at the time of the second launch. At a top speed of 25 knots and an average wind, there was now absolutely no doubt that a combat-laden B-25 land bomber could make a carrier takeoff. While Duncan was busy working out the Navy's part in the coming operation, Doolittle continued necessary actions to coordinate the Air Force share. Modification of the planes had to be accomplished as soon as possible. New gas tanks had to be designed, drawings made, a contractor found, the planes scheduled into the modification center and tests made of the installations. All this had to be done before the crews were selected and trained. To make the April 1st deadline meant Doolittle would have to have top priority and carte blanche everywhere he went. As Arnold knew, it would take all the Doolittle energy, know-how, and personality to get the job done. Taking first things first, Doolittle checked into the contractors best qualified to modify the B-25s. On January 22nd, he formally requested that one B-25B airplane be made available to the Mid-Continent Airlines at Minneapolis, Minnesota on January 23, 1942, or at the earliest possible moment thereafter. He further asked that 17 more B-25s be delivered to Mid-Continent Airlines for alteration as required. On January 23rd, Doolittle arrived at Wright Field to confer with Brigadier General George C. Kenney. He explained to Kenney what he needed in the way of assistance for the B-25B special project, but he did not tell him why. Kenney called in his top civilian and military experts, and Doolittle laid out his requirements succinctly, again without mentioning the reasons. Not only were extra gas tanks to be installed and the associated plumbing designed, but new bomb shackles and other special equipment would be needed. Several planes were to be equipped with small electrically operated cameras which would take 60 pictures at half-second intervals, starting automatically when the first bomb dropped. The others were to carry 16mm cameras similarly mounted. Landing flares were to be relocated forward of the rear armored bulkhead to protect them better against enemy fire. The toughest part of the job, Doolittle told them, would be the installation of the auxiliary gas tanks. A 265-gallon leak-proof tank would have to fit into the bomb bay, leaving room underneath for 4 500-pound bombs. The second tank should be a collapsible rubber bag affair that could be put into the crawlway between the front and rear compartments. In the week between his visits to Wright Field, Doolittle had set other wheels in motion. He asked General Arnold to have the intelligence staff select the best targets in Japan for the mission. On January 31st, Brigadier General Carl Spaatz, Arnold's deputy for intelligence, replied with a list of industrial targets located in Tokyo, Kobe, Nagoya, Yokohama, and 6 other major cities. Iron, steel, magnesium, and aluminum industries were listed, along with aircraft plants, petroleum refineries, and naval objectives. Beside each target suggestion was the reason for its selection. From this basic list, Arnold directed that target folders be prepared without delay. A few days after Doolittle had been tapped to plan for his mission, the other projects of which the carrier-based raid was only a part also began to take shape. The HALPRO project of locating a heavy bombardment group in China was in the final planning stages, and on January 26, the air staff was directed to activate the headquarters and headquarters squadron. President Roosevelt, impatient for air action against the Japanese homeland, had inquired as to the feasibility of operating heavy bombers from Mongolia. Without specifically mentioning either the HALPRO or Doolittle projects, Arnold replied to the President on January 28, "In reply to your recent inquiry, please permit me to advise you that there is no present means of operating heavy bombardment aircraft from Outer Mongolia, viz., east of Urga, and between Urga and the Outer Mongolia-Manchukuo border, without the definite cooperation of the Russian government. The Chinese government has had no effective control of Outer Mongolia for the past several years, and no control is attempted by the Chungking government to any important extent beyond Lanzhou in Kansu province, the Gobi Desert north of Kansu forming a fairly effective natural barrier. For this reason I feel that the plan which is now in progress, for carrying out an attack upon the Japanese enemy's center of gravity, by making use of facilities for which the Chinese government can guarantee us a reasonable degree of security on the Eastern Asiatic mainland, is the logical and most effective plan. When the energetic Doolittle was reasonably sure that he had gotten all the different phases of his project started, he returned to his office in room 4414 of the munitions building. Closing the door, he sat down at his desk and began to ponder over what he had done in the previous month. Had he really tied up all the loose ends? The blueprints from Kenny's experts were completed, and planes were being modified, crews were to be selected, armament was being prepared. What else needed to be done? Reaching into his desk drawer, Doolittle withdrew a pad of lined tablet paper and began to write, Subject B-25 Special Project 2 Commanding General, Army Air Forces. The purpose of this special project is to drop explosives and fire the industrial center of Japan. It is anticipated that this will not only cause confusion and impede production, but will undoubtedly facilitate operation against Japan in other theaters due to their probable withdrawal of troops for the purpose of defending the home country. An action of this kind is most desirable now due to the psychological effect on the American public, our allies, and our enemies. The method contemplated is to bring carrier-borne bombers to within 400 to 500 miles, all distances mentioned will be in statute miles, of the coast of Japan, preferably to the southeast. They will then take off from the carrier deck and proceed directly to selected objectives. These objectives will be military and industrial targets in the Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Osaka-Kobe areas. Simultaneous bombings of these areas is contemplated with the bombers coming in up waterways from the southeast and, after dropping their explosives, returning in the same direction. After clearing the Japanese outside coastline a sufficient distance, a general westerly course will be set for one or more of the following airports in China: Chuzhou, Lishui, Yushan and/or Chianu. Chuzhou is about 70 miles inland and 200 miles to the south-southwest of Shanghai. After refueling, the airplanes will proceed to the strong Chinese airbase at Chungking, about 800 miles distant, and from there to such ultimate objective as may, at that time, be indicated. The greatest non-stop distance that any airplane will have to fly is 2,000 miles. 18 B-25B, North American medium bomber, airplanes will be employed in this raid. Each will carry about 1,100 gallons of gasoline, which assures a range of 2,400 miles at 5,000 feet altitude in still air. Each bomber will carry 2 500-pound demolition bombs and as near as possible to 1,000 pounds of incendiaries. The demolition bombs will be dropped first, and then the incendiaries. The extra gasoline will be carried in a 275-gallon auxiliary leak-proof tank in the top of the bomb bay and a 175-gallon flexible rubber tank in the passageway above the bomb bay. It is anticipated that the gasoline from this top tank will be used up and the tank flattened out or rolled up and removed prior to entering the combat zone. This assures that the airplane will be fully operational and minimizes the fire and explosion hazard characteristic of a near-empty tank. In all other respects, the airplanes are conventional. The work of installing the required additional tankage is being done by Mid-Continent Airlines at Minneapolis. All production and installation work is progressing according to schedule, and the 24 airplanes, 6 spares, should be completely converted by March 15th. Extensive range and performance tests will be conducted on number 1 article while the others are being converted. A short period will be required to assemble and give special training to the crews. The training will include teamwork in bombing, gunnery, navigation, flying, short takeoff, and at least 1 carrier takeoff for each pilot. If the crews are selected promptly from men familiar with their jobs, and the B-25B airplane, the complete unit should be ready for loading on the carrier by April 1st. General operational instructions will be issued just before takeoff from the carrier. Due to the greater accuracy of daylight bombing, a daylight raid is contemplated. The present concept of the project calls for a night takeoff from the carrier and arrival over objectives at dawn. Rapid refueling at the landing points will permit arrival at Chungking before dark. A night raid will be made if, due to last-minute information received from our intelligence section or other source, a daylight raid is definitely inadvisable. The night raid should be made on a clear night, moonlight if Japan is blacked out, moonless if it is not. All available pertinent information regarding targets and defenses will be obtained from A2, G2 and other existent sources. The Navy has already supervised takeoff tests made at Norfolk, Virginia, using 3 B-25B bombers carrying loads of 23,000 pounds and 26,000 pounds and 29,000 pounds. These tests indicate that no difficulty need be anticipated in taking off from the carrier deck with a gross load of around 31,000 pounds. The Navy will be charged with providing a carrier, probably the Hornet, loading and storing the airplanes, and with delivering them to the takeoff position. The Chemical Warfare Service is designing and preparing special incendiary bomb clusters in order to assure that the maximum amount that limited space permits, up to 1,000 pounds per airplane, may be carried. 48 of these clusters will be ready for shipment from Edgewood Arsenal by March 15th. About 20,000 United States gallons of 100-octane aviation gasoline and 600 gallons of lubricating oil will be laid down at Chuchao and associated fields. All other supplies and necessary emergency repair equipment will be carried on the airplanes. First Lieutenant Harry W. Howes, now with the Air Service Command and formerly with the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, will be charged with making arrangements for the fuel caches in China. He will work through A2 and A4 and with Colonel Claire Chenot, a former Air Corps officer and now aviation advisor to the Chinese government. Colonel Chenot should assign a responsible American or a Chinese who speaks English to physically check and assure that the supplies are in place. This man should also be available to assist the crews in servicing the airplanes. That the supplies are in place can be indicated by suitable radio code signal. Work on placing supplies must start at once. Shortly before the airplanes arrive, the proper Chinese agencies should be advised that the airplanes are coming soon, but the inference will be that they are flying up from the south in order to stage a raid on Japan from which they plan to return to the same base. Radio signals from the bombing planes immediately they drop their explosives may be used to indicate arrival at gassing points some 6 or 7 hours later. Care must be exercised to see that the Chinese are advised just in time, as any information given to the Chinese may be expected to fall into Japanese hands, and a premature notification would be fatal to the project. An initial study of meteorological conditions indicates that the sooner the raid is made, the better will be the prevailing weather conditions. The weather will become increasingly unfavorable after the end of April. Weather was considered largely from the point of view of avoiding morning fog over Tokyo and other targets, low overcast over Chuchao and Chungking, icing and strong westerly winds. If possible, daily weather predictions or anticipated weather conditions at Chungking and the coast should be sent at a specified time in suitable code in order to assist the meteorologist on the carrier in analyzing his forecasts. Lieutenant Colonel J.H. Doolittle, Air Corps, will be in charge of the preparations for and will be in personal command of the project. Other flight personnel will, due to the considerable hazard incident to such a mission, be volunteers. Each airplane will carry its normal complement of 5 crew members: pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, radio operator, and gunner, mechanic. One crew member will be a competent meteorologist and one an experienced navigator. All navigators will be trained in celestial navigation. 2 ground liaison officers will be assigned. One will remain on the mainland and the other on the carrier. At least 3 crew members will speak Chinese, 1 in each of the target units. Should the Russians be willing to accept delivery of 18 B-25B airplanes on lease-lend at Vladivostok, our problem would be greatly simplified and conflict with the Halvorsen project avoided. It had taken Doolittle about 2 hours to draft this memorandum. He knew now that there were still some things to be done. Each of the elements of the plan had to be followed up. There would probably be some compromises and changes, but if any single one of the important details were overlooked or not completed on time, the success of the mission would be in doubt. Most worrisome of all was the installation of the extra gas tanks. The matter of gas tank capacity could mean the difference between landing in enemy or friendly territory, between death and survival. The only thing that would be more important to the crews than gasoline would be their defensive guns. Both gas and gun problems were almost to doom the entire mission. On January 30th, Colonel John Y. York of General Arnold's staff penned his signature on a directive memorandum to the Material Division requesting that the number of B-25B airplanes to be modified for the Doolittle project by mid-continent be increased from the original number of 18 to 24. 24 bombers were needed to assure at least 15 for the mission, and that number could be obtained most handily from the 3 squadrons of the 17th Bombardment Group, located at Pendleton, Oregon, and its associated 89th Reconnaissance Squadron. The choice of the airplane for the operation had actually determined the choice of the units that would furnish the crews. It was easiest to draw all crews from the squadrons furnishing the planes rather than leave them without equipment. On February 3rd, the group received orders to transfer without delay to the Columbia Army Air Base, Columbia, South Carolina. The new commanding officer of the 17th, appointed just before the group left Pendleton, was Lieutenant Colonel William C. Mills. While his unit was getting ready to move its ground and air echelons, Mills was instructed to pass the word among his squadrons and the 89th, commanded by Major John A. Hilger, that volunteers were needed for an extremely hazardous mission, which would require the highest degree of skill and would be of great value to the war effort. By the time the 4 squadrons reached Columbia, the response was overwhelming. On Mills's recommendation, Doolittle selected Hilger as his deputy and explained that he would be responsible for taking 24 qualified crews and such ground personnel he would need to Eglin Field, Florida, to get started on a training program. They would prepare themselves for a mission that would require a takeoff from a carrier, bombing a target en route, and a landing in China, where the planes would probably be delivered to the Chinese Air Force. Doolittle would commute between Washington and Eglin and handle all the planning. Hilger would be in charge of the group at Eglin in Doolittle's absence. Colonel Mills had delegated to his 3 squadron commanders, Captain Edward J. York, Captain Al Rutherford, and Captain Carl Baumeister, the task of coming up with the names of the men they recommended for the mysterious mission. All 3 had volunteered, but Mills could allow only York to go. Since practically every man in the 3 squadrons of the 17th and the 89th had volunteered, the 4 squadron commanders concerned made up rosters of an approximately equal number of men to make up the 24 crews. Mechanics, armourers, radio men, and other ground support personnel were also designated and ordered to proceed to Eglin as fast as planes could be made available to transport them. Hilger and the major part of the contingent arrived at the Florida base between February 27th and March 3rd. No one except Hilger yet knew anything about the project nor what was expected of them. Hilger had cautioned them all not to speak to anyone and to get their planes ready for combat training missions as soon as possible. The men's previous combat experience was limited to submarine patrol missions off the Oregon and Washington coast. Although one crew had sunk a Japanese submarine, most of these missions were uneventful, and the men had not yet flown over enemy territory against anti-aircraft fire. At Eglin they were assigned barracks and an operations building on the flight line apart from other units on the base. The commanding officer of the base had been informed only that this detachment was to undergo special training, and that he was to provide such facilities and supplies as they required. Before Doolittle had left Columbia for Washington, Hilger had suggested that it might be a good idea if a Navy flying instructor were assigned to the project for a short time to teach the pilots about carrier takeoffs. Army Air Force's pilots were not trained in getting heavily loaded bombers off in the distance of a carrier flight deck. Navy pilots were required to be proficient in carrier takeoffs and landings before graduation from flying school. Lieutenant Henry L. Miller, United States Navy, flying instructor at Pensacola Naval Air Station, was ordered to Eglin to train the Army pilots in carrier takeoff procedure. Years later, he recalled his impressions. "I reported to the commanding officer of the field. It was from him that I learned that Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle was the commanding officer of the B-25 detachment. I figured something big was cooking. When I arrived at the B-25 headquarters, I met Captains Ski York, Davy Jones, and Ross Greening. I told them why I was reporting aboard. They seemed surprised. I did not know that the whole operation was still a mystery to them. After we chatted a while, they asked me if I had flown a B-25 before. I had to be honest. I had never even seen a B-25 yet. They took me outside and I got my first look. Man, how I wanted to get my hands on that airplane. After taking a look at some of the performance data and pilots' handbooks, we all climbed into the plane on that Sunday afternoon, proceeded to an auxiliary field that had been set aside for the group, and made 2 practice takeoffs. I acted as co-pilot for Davy Jones and Ski York, while Ross Greening observed. I gave them instructions and they followed me to the letter. On the first takeoff, the indicated airspeed was 50 miles an hour. The 3 Army pilots were skeptical and would not believe that we could take that plane off with a gross weight of 27,000 pounds at 50 miles an hour. They agreed that the airspeed indicator must be off. On the second takeoff, with Davy Jones at the controls, we got off at an indicated 60 miles an hour because Jones held it on the ground a bit longer than York had done. Even so, the 3 of them were convinced. They did not know it then, but before they were finished, they would be able to take off from 350 feet in a 40-knot wind, with the plane loaded to 31,000 pounds, 32,000 pounds over its designed maximum load. On March 3rd, Doolittle landed at Eglin and the entire group of about 140 men assembled to hear him. It was a typical Doolittle pitch, short and to the point. "My name's Doolittle. I have been put in charge of the project that you men have volunteered for. It is a tough one, and it will be the most dangerous thing any of you have ever been on. Any man can drop out and nothing will ever be said about it. The operation must be made up entirely of volunteers. If anyone wants to bow out, he can do so right now." Doolittle stopped talking and the room was quiet. Several hands went up simultaneously, and Doolittle nodded toward a young second lieutenant nearest him. "Sir, can you give us any more information about the mission?" the lad asked. "No, I am sorry, I cannot right now," Doolittle answered. "But I am sure you will start getting some ideas about it when we get down to work. Now, that brings up the most important point I have got to make to you, and you are going to hear this over and over again. This entire mission must be kept top secret. I not only do not want you to tell your wives or buddies about it, I do not even want you to discuss it among yourselves." Doolittle paused again to let his words sink in and continued. "The lives of many men are going to depend on how well you keep this project to yourselves. Not only your lives, but the lives of hundreds of others will be endangered, because there are a lot of people working on this thing. Do not start any rumors and do not pass any along. If anybody outside the project gets nosy, get his name and give it to me. The Federal Bureau of Investigation will find out all about him. Our training here will stress teamwork. I want every man to do his assigned job. We have got a lot of work to do on those planes to get them in shape. There is a lot of training in store for navigators, bombardiers, and engineer gunners. For the pilots, the main thing is to learn how to take the B-25 off in the shortest possible distance with heavy loads. We have got about 3 weeks, maybe less. Remember, if anyone wants to drop out, he can. No questions asked. That is all for now." As the project commander, Doolittle set up his organization along standard squadron lines. Major Jack Hilger was appointed executive officer, Major Harvey Johnson, adjutant, Captain Ski York, operations officer, Captain David M. Jones, navigation and intelligence officer, Captain C. Ross Greening, gunnery and bombing officer, First Lieutenant Bill Bauer, engineering officer, and First Lieutenant Travis Hoover, supply officer. During the first few days at Eglin, Doolittle took these officers aside and told them the general nature of their mission without specifically telling them what the targets were to be. He told them they would learn their destination only when aboard the carrier and on their way. He brought them up to date on how and why certain decisions had been made, such as the selection of the B-25, the main objective of the raid, and how the airplanes were to be carried within reach of the targets. This was done because Doolittle knew that these factors would affect the training program. Secrecy was again stressed. It seemed to be uppermost in his thoughts. He saw to it that it was in everyone else's as well. From the first day of training, it was clearly understood that all 24 crews would take the training and go aboard the carrier, even though only about 15 planes would be taken. This was done for two reasons. No word could leak out from disappointed crews if they were on the carrier, and there would be plenty of extra crew members available to replace those who might become ill or decided to withdraw from the mission at the last minute. The first part of the flying training program was quick takeoff practice. For the Army pilots, unaccustomed to near-stall takeoffs, this practice was a harrowing experience. Throughout their cadet training days, they had been taught always to have plenty of airspeed before flying a plane off the ground. They were used to flying from 5,000-foot runways. Yanking the B-25 off with the tail skid almost dragging the ground was a most unnatural attitude to them. But with Hank Miller's encouragement and criticism, they soon learned. All pilots, Miller recalled, with the exception of a few conservatives, caught on quickly. Doolittle, Gray, and Jones were particularly outstanding. But it was found that constant practice had to be given because pilots were prone to switch back to the conventional takeoff. In addition to takeoff practice at the Eglin Auxiliary Fields, other training missions were scheduled concurrently. Originally, it was decided that each crew would receive 50 hours of flying time to be spent on day and night navigation, gunnery, bombing, and formation flying. However, maintenance problems and troubles with the gas tank installations and gun turrets cut this time down considerably. Consequently, most crews flew only about half the number of hours planned. Before navigation flights could be made, Doolittle required all engine and flight instruments calibrated and fuel consumption checked. Since each plane was to fly not less than 1,900 miles on a little over 1,100 gallons of gas, all engines had to operate at maximum efficiency. All during the practice and testing, the gas tank modifications were a constant source of trouble. The 265-gallon steel tanks leaked profusely, and new 225-gallon self-sealing tanks were installed in their place. Still, there were leaks in the connections and other mechanical problems. A third tank of 60-gallon capacity was later installed in the position from which the lower gun turret was removed. The filler neck of this tank was accessible to the rear gunner in flight. 10 5-gallon cans of gasoline were to be carried in the rear compartment and poured into this tank as the gasoline level went down. The total gas capacity, theoretically, amounted to the following: main wing tanks, 646 gallons, bomb bay tanks, 225 gallons, crawlway tank, 160 gallons, rear turret tank, 60 gallons, 10 5-gallon cans, 50 gallons, total 1,140, 1 gallons. De-icing boots were installed on the leading edges of the wings and tail surfaces and anti-icing equipment for the propellers. At this point in the planning, it had not yet been decided whether East China or Vladivostok was to be the destination, and icing conditions did prevail along the northern route to Vladivostok. 2 landing flares were installed forward of the armored bulkhead behind each pilot. If they were needed, they would have to be thrown out of the rear hatch by the gunner. Since the mission required absolute radio silence and weight was a problem, the 230-pound liaison radio set was to be removed from each plane. In order to prevent unintentional broadcasts by improper use of the interphone, the coils were also to be removed from the command transmitters and stowed elsewhere within each plane for use upon arrival at the destination. While all of these modifications and installations were important, none of them was more important than the armament. Unless a bomber is properly equipped to defend itself, its chances of survival against a determined enemy are slim. The B-25Bs of 1942 vintage were woefully deficient in their firepower. They were equipped with top and bottom turrets, neither of which was satisfactory. The tail was unprotected, and the nose contained a single-point .30 caliber flexible machine gun that the bombardier had to move from one gun port to another.